Ellen Ching, I think I see you there. Okay. Terry Gorman, hi Terry, see you. Senator Joyce M. Buenaventura. Thank you. Thank you for coming on camera. Representative Brian Yamane. Rep. Yamane, are you on?
It's on, so I muted, so.
Okay, I'll circle back. Randy Gons.
Present. Aloha.
Thank you. Nice and loud. Wendy Gibson.
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me? Great.
Louding. Thank you. Nikos Leverance.
Present. Good afternoon.
Thank you. And Garrett Haladyer, I see you. Hi, Garrett.
Hello.
Okay, and my name is Michelle Nakata with Department of Health. I'm going to circle back just again really quickly. Dr. James Ireland,
Just for your awareness.
are you on?
Yeah, GB forward, so.
And Representative Yamane. Okay, so I count 12 present. We just need 8 to establish quorum, so we have quorum. Thank you.
To members of the public who are watching the meeting on Zoom in person or listening by phone, we have 2 substantive agenda items today. The first will be a presentation by Devon Ward, who's here in person. Thank you, Mr. Ward, on the status of federal preemption related to cannabis. The second agenda item goes to issues not included in the scope of the 5 established working groups that should be identified for future consideration and study by the legislature. Testifiers will have 2 minutes to provide their testimony on the agenda items. I will give you a 30-second warning and we'll call time at 2 minutes to provide everyone the opportunity to speak while allowing adequate time for the task force members to work through the agenda items. All testimony will only be heard before each agenda item. So let's take the first agenda item. Is there anyone? I have one name of a person here in person who wishes to testify on agenda item 2. Amy, I apologize. I can't read your last name, but I know your first name is Amy.
Nielsen.
Nielsen, please.
No? Yes. Excellent. Good afternoon. My name is Amy R. Nielsen. I'm a clinical nutritionist, herbalist, and cannabis researcher. I'm also a Hawaii 329 patient and a former dispensary employee here in Hawaii. Preemption of federal law over state regulation of cannabis, given the scheduling status held by certain cultivars of this plant, highlight ethical concerns associated with maintaining a medical cannabis program upon the implementation of a dual use system. Specifically, the loss of qualified practitioners, loss of registered patients, and diminished specialized product selection, which together limits the access and negatively impacts the quality of life for cardholding members. Cardholding patients. Particularly, this potential loss of practitioners to advise patients on medical implications of use drives patients to seek answers from dispensary staff who are directly limited in their scope of jurisdiction over imparting medically relevant knowledge. Hawaii's unique geography and indigenous historical use of cannabis and current vertically integrated program demands a close inspection of the potential impact on the existing medical program upon standing up any sort of dual use system in this environment. As this task force moves forward in the changing federal legal environment, I urge complete reassessment of the current medical cannabis program, specifically addressing improvements to access to appropriately educated providers, specialized product categories, and increasing the qualifying condition list with the goal of expanding and supporting current and future patient populations. Strengthening the medical cannabis program in Hawaii deepens our commitment to our community and shows the continued aloha this body has for its citizens. Mahalo nui loa for your attention, and I hope you'll take time to read the written testimony provided.
Ms. Nielsen, thank you for taking the time to be here. Task force members, after each testifier, I'm going to ask if you have any questions. If so, please unmute yourself and state your name before you ask your question. Any questions for Ms. Nielsen?
I do. This is Wendy Gibson Viviani. I'm a medical cannabis nurse. You said that you're a cannabis researcher. Can you send us links to your research?
Yes, that research is all provided actually on the written testimony.
It is. Okay, thank you. I didn't see it.
Task force members, any other questions for Ms. Nielsen?
Oh, I do see it.
Okay.
All right, hearing none. Okay, we're now ready to move to online testifiers. If anyone online would like to submit testimony on agenda item 2, please raise your hand. When I call your name, you will be asked to unmute. Go ahead and unmute yourself. If you feel comfortable, please turn on your camera. Tammy, do we have anyone? All right, so Tammy's going to bring you the names in just a minute. And again, I would remind our testifiers that we are focused now on agenda item 2, which is the anticipated presentation from Mr. Ward on the status of federal preemption related to cannabis. I have a Mark Gordon. Mr. Gordon, are you prepared to give your testimony?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Please proceed.
All right, thank you. First of all, I wanted to appreciate that the state is now having a task force to look into this issue, which I think is critical. And as I know, it's in the regulation, and I just wanted to appreciate the task force and all the work you're doing. Regarding recreational marijuana, I wanted to state that many states have and are continuing to legalize marijuana. There has not been, to my knowledge, any significant increase or crime with this issue. In addition, DOH so far has done a great job with our medical marijuana program. I have friends that have worked at dispensaries and in management, and I know DOH is very stringent on this, and I'm sure would also be so in the recreational area. Also, I believe besides more access for recreational marijuana, it would also be a substantial increase in financial benefits to the state. So thank you for allowing me to share my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. Task force members, any questions for Mr. Gordon? Hearing none, we'll move on. The next testifier by Zoom is Mr. Clifton Oto. Mr. Oto, you prepared to testify?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
You're welcome. Please proceed.
Well, thank you, Chair, members of the task force. Good afternoon. And by the way, happy National PTSD Awareness Day 2022. Thanks for the opportunity to testify on agenda item 2 regarding MPP's presentation on federal preemption as it applies to cannabis. MPP's position on federal preemption is well known because it's posted on their website. And it involves the fact that states have reserved the authority to decide how cannabis is used within the state, that states are not forcing people to violate federal law, and that the Rohrabacher-Farr appropriations rider that must be renewed each year by Congress provides some protections to programs and to patients. And while these findings are true, this approach to federal preemption is dangerous, because it can create the impression that it's okay for states to create cannabis programs where patients and residents must violate federal law to participate, often without even knowing that they're violating federal law or being aware of the negative consequences that could befall them. I believe this is called entrapment. Our state needs to take action on this conflict with the federal regulation of marijuana. And when I say state, I'm referring to the executive branch. We cannot expect our patients and end users who are already violating federal law to incriminate themselves by approaching the DEA for a solution to this conflict. Fortunately, our state legislature has already taken action on this issue. So please do not insult our state lawmakers and their staff and their legal counsel by inferring that our legislature did not know what it was doing when both chambers unanimously adopted HCR 132 during the 2021 regular session. I'm available for any questions. Aloha.
Mr. Oto, thanks for taking the time. Task force members, any questions for Mr. Oto?
Yeah, this is Jim Ireland. I have a question. Excuse me.
Sure, please.
Can you just briefly, Mr. Oto, Dr. Oto, elaborate on just some potential solutions that would be available to this committee, remedies?
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now? It might just be my computer.
Oh, no, we can hear you very clearly. Mr. Oto is on mute. He's trying to respond, but we cannot hear his answer
Got
to
it.
the question. It looks like he's having difficulty unmuting. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Great. So thank you, Dr. Ireland, for that question. I think that the task force does have certain actions before it that it can take because of the working groups that you have. And so this seems like a great opportunity for perhaps one working group in particular, or perhaps a additional working group that could look at this specifically. But what are the options available that the state could act upon? We already have one potential solution that our legislature unanimously adopted. So I think the point is we can't allow this conflict to continue. We cannot just sit back and wait for the federal government to come up with a solution. And it may be highly irresponsible to expand the state authorized use of cannabis without doing something at the state level about this issue at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oto.
Okay, thank you. But really, at the end of the day, we are subject to the whim of the federal government if they're not going to change.
Well, so if the DEA is not going to cooperate, then it not only depends on the will of the DEA, but also the will of the state. How important is this to the state to protect our patients from all of the discrimination that is going on every day and destroying our patients' lives? If they had the will and you know, maybe the DEA, if there was a solution that was brought to them, they could say, well, this is amazing. Somebody finally figured this out. There is a solution that could help relieve this conflict while perhaps a federal solution is also being worked on. But if they were to fight, then yes, there may need to be a response. And whether the state is willing to make that response, I guess would be something that they would have to look at. But I think that it's necessary to look at possible solutions, not look at whether it's going to fail or not, but at least come up with solutions that seem reasonable and put those to our state lawmakers next session so that they can reconsider those.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for the testifier?
Yes, Dr. Otto. So when the state recognized the medical use of cannabis back in 2000, shouldn't that have led to removal from the state's Controlled Substance Act? I mean, it no longer meets the criteria for qualifying as a Schedule I once you recognize the medicinal use. So is that part of what we're trying to do here?
Well, so the first part of that is our Uniform Controlled Substances is not the same as the Federal Controlled Substances Act, even though that's what was recommended by the Uniform Controlled Substances Commission. Our state changed the criteria for Schedule I controlled substances when it adopted our Uniform Controlled Substances Act. So there is no mention of accepted medical use. So so cannabis can stay in state Schedule I, and there is no conflict because our scheduling doesn't even consider accepted medical use. But I would also say that our Medical Use of Cannabis Act creates a state exemption for the medical use of cannabis. Some people will call it a carve out. because our patients are not subjected to the criminal penalties that are associated with the possession of cannabis as a state Schedule I controlled substance. So we already have a state exemption. A logical progression would be a federal exemption.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you, Doctor. Thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Otto from the task force?
Terry Gorman, County of Maui. I do have a question for Dr. Otto. Dr. Otto, has any other state successfully enacted this kind of legislation that basically exempts the state from the Schedule I?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question, Terry. Currently, Iowa and Minnesota are both working on legislation to address this issue, and I'm happy to provide links to those pieces of legislature. Iowa has already sent a letter to the DEA requesting guarantees that federal funding will not be withheld from their schools and long-term care facilities, which are currently violating federal law because students, if they were allowed to use cannabis on campus, would be violating federal law. Residents in hospice would be violating federal law, and that could make it difficult for these places to get Medicare Part B reimbursement issue right now. And Iowa is currently waiting for a response from the DEA. There's also a petition from a resident in Iowa that is asking for a state exemption for their patients.
Thank you for that. As a member of the medical use PIG group, I'd be quite keen to follow progress on both of those initiatives, and if there are any other states that are making progress, because I agree with you, this is a huge issue for our registered patients here in Hawaii. Thank you, Dr. Otto.
Thank you.
I do have one more quick question.
Sure, please.
Is anyone familiar with the lawsuit that the ACLU has filed in the state of Nevada about they're trying to, I don't know, sue them to get it cannabis out of the Schedule I drug category?
And I want to limit this question specifically to Dr. Otto. Dr.
Okay.
Otto, are you familiar with the litigation?
I'm not familiar with that litigation.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, thanks.
Any other task force members? Dr. Otto has been very patient in answering a number of your questions. Anyone else have any questions? All right, seeing none, we're going to move to, thank you, Dr. Otto, very much. We're now going to move to Mr. Alfred Medeiros. And Mr. Medeiros, just to remind you that, like Dr. Otto, we're asking you to keep your testimony to the subject of federal preemption related to cannabis. Please proceed.
Okay. Aloha mai kaku, Alfred Kapiona Medeiros. I'm a Kanaka Maoli from Hawaii. My concern is mainly what's going to happen with our Hawaiian lands. I know we last talked about it, but if we're going to full recreational, I know there's going to be some Hawaiian land that's going to be used for farming, which I am okay with, but there needs to be more discussions about what's happening with the Kanaka that own the land and the people that rightfully own the land. You know, we don't want big business to come and take over like California and elsewhere. This is why this task force is involved. We need to let the people like Ms. Mayfu Monopoi get involved in the task force. She's very involved in our community. I look around, I don't see too much people that's been to many of the events and gatherings that there is. I just ask that people get out there. You know, like the same thing I tell the politicians, you guys gotta go on field trips. Check out the farmers. I'm a small craft farmer. I'm a small farmer. So it's always gonna be small farmers first and locals first. We don't want big corporate entities to come in and just use us like how they've been using Kanaka Maoli, right? It's tourism, it's commercialism. We don't want that anymore. We need to protect that part of it. So my main concern is the people's rights, the farmers' rights, Kanaka Maoli rights. And main thing first is the patients' rights, right? Because we've been going through this for so long. People have been fighting for years. I was one of the organizers of the Hawaii Cannabis Expo. You know, we've been trying to talk to people for years about this. And we've been talking to deaf ears, as always. We need to actually come together as a group of people of Hawaii to do what's right. to ensure that our medical patients, or if we go full rec, that the people get the proper clean medicine.
And 30 seconds, sir, just ask.
So mahalo for you guys' time, mahalo for this, and if you guys get room on the task force on Kanaka, I'm open and volunteer if you guys need me. So
Thanks.
mahalo again.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Task force members, any questions for Mr. Maderos? All right, I'm hearing no questions. We do have two more Zoom testifiers. Ms. Lori Kihani, and again, Ms. Kihani, if you could limit your testimony to the federal preemption issue related to cannabis. Ms. Kihani.
Okay, hi. I have sent in written testimony. I'm a 329 card holder. So is other members of our family and my son. I have a very different perspective than all, from what I've heard so far. I hope this is the right agenda item for me. It concerns me that people in Hawaii could actually be, found guilty by the federal government if something changed with our government, with everything that has changed in the last week. I'm terrified by what I'm hearing here. My son was pulled over last weekend, not this past weekend, but the last weekend, because he was acting strangely. My son is suffering from cannabis-induced psychosis, and he thinks it's his medicine. And I beg to differ with the first person who said that the dispensaries are doing a really good job monitoring this, but my son buys way too much. And he had his car confiscated in Hana because of the fact that he had way too much in the car. I didn't know that he couldn't do that. He didn't know that he couldn't do that. We're both card holders. And fortunately, the reason why they pulled him over was because he was acting strange. And I can totally understand
You have 30 seconds. I'm just asking you to wrap up your testimony, please. Thank you.
So what I'm saying to you is that they didn't find anything else other than medical marijuana in his car. But if there's a problem with the DEA coming in, I'm extremely terrified for what this could mean for all of us. So, I really want to see this legalized in the state of Hawaii. I want to see it regulated in the state of Hawaii. And I want to see that we are all protected in the state of Hawaii.
Thank you, Ms. Kiani. You've exceeded your 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask that we're going to move on at this point, but we'll move on to any questions the task force members might have for Ms. Kiani. Task force members, any questions? Hearing none, we have one final Zoom testifier, Dr. Sue Sisley. Dr. Sisley. Doctor, are you there? All right, I don't see or hear Dr. Sisley, so we're going to move on. One more, all right?
Can you guys hear me?
Oh, we can hear you. Yeah, sure. Please proceed. Thank you.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry, I couldn't hear you guys. Yeah, this is my name is Sue Sisley. I'm a physician. I'm based in Arizona, but I actually serve as a volunteer medical director for over 40 different cannabis license holders in 18 different states over the past 11 years. I wanted to share some ideas for how to keep your program medical if you guys do adopt a recreational model in Hawaii. There is some methods of preserving the medical program, making sure it doesn't get steamrolled by rec. I think the most important subject is maintaining a legal framework for patient co-ops. A great example, that co-op on the North Shore has been extremely valuable to our veterans and terminally ill patients. The prices of licensed dispensaries, the prices of all these products are exorbitant, impossible for sick patients to afford, but the co-ops are offering legal access for an affordable price. So I hope that you can guarantee that these co-ops and home grow will always be a vibrant, fortified legal status within your program in perpetuity. They should never be allowed to be removed by the industry as it continues to grow. I can tell you, I've been a medical director in many states that have added recreational cannabis later. And the first thing that happens once you convert to recreational is that the local license holders will sell their licenses or just sell their board seats to larger corporate behemoths, Curaleaf, Verano, Trulieve, and then they will terminate medical staff like pharmacists and nurses that were hired
Dr.
mostly
Sisley,
as.
you have 30 seconds. I'm gonna ask you to
Okay,
wrap it up.
thank you. Yep. So, so I think once Hawaii licenses are eventually transferred to large MSOs and your licenses get added to their investor decks, and suddenly you've immediately lost the local control and the local pride that your residents insisted was important, keeping things local when you first started the medical program years ago. So be
Okay,
careful
Doctor,
with
thank
your
you so
email.
much. I'm gonna have to interrupt you at that point, and I'm gonna entertain questions from the task force for Dr. Sisley. Any task force members have questions for Dr. Sisley? Please proceed.
Hi, yes, this is Nico Sleverance. I would like to encourage Dr. Sisley to submit some written testimony on what she just talked about. I think it's a very important and salient topic for the larger task force. Mahalo.
Thank
I
you. Any other
appreciate
task
that. Oh, I was
Thank-
going to mention, I did actually submit testimony online. So if you guys get a chance to review it, that would be great.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that task force members get it if they haven't already. Any other task force members have any questions for Dr. Sisley?
I do.
Sure, please proceed, Ms. Gordon.
This is Wendy Gibson Viviani.
Yes,
Dr. Sisley, can you just briefly mention how legalization has created funding for cannabis research?
Yes. So what happened was actually the recreational marijuana never created research money. It was all the medical program. What happened was we took all of our surplus money from collecting licensing fees and card fees from patients. We had in Arizona over 10 years, we had raised almost $100 million in surplus funds that was voter protected. So it couldn't be swept by the legislature. And it was eventually used. We just allocated 25 million of the medical marijuana revenues toward conducting FDA clinical trials on cannabis as a medicine for treating autism, pain, things like that. But the point is that recreational program has never contributed a dime to research, and that's very sad. I hope that if you do implement a rec program later, that you insist that a portion of the tax revenue does go to research, because it's really sad. In fact, the industry has not been supportive of allowing those tax revenues to go to research, because they want to go to the usual, targets like education and law enforcement, which are all really valuable and important, but ultimately there's enough tax revenue to go around to actually support multiple different entities that could benefit the advancement of science as well. So I hope that I will tell you that the revenues generated from rec are not nearly what are projected ever in all these states that I work in. You always get these huge dollar signs put in front of the electeds, and then ultimately it never really pans out that way, especially because the industry doesn't have banking yet. So the accounting of this,
Dr. Sisley, in the interest of time, I'm gonna just want to entertain any more questions for the doctor, specifically on the issue of federal preemption. Any other
I
task force?
do, Terry Gorman, co-chair of the medical use PIG. I would like to know if Dr. Sisley would be interested in speaking with our group as an expert at a later time so we can have an in-depth discussion with her.
Doctor?
Yes, sir. I would love to help with that. And I tried to put that in my testimony, my written testimony, that if you guys want me to do a more, I've listed several items in the testimony that could be helpful, but I'd like to have a chance to elaborate on those in a future meeting, and I'm happy to join you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Ms.
Dr.
Gorman,
Sisley.
Ms. Gorman, that sounds like a resounding yes.
Yes,
So I-
thank you very much for that.
Any other questions for Dr. Sisley before we move on to our final online testifier? Hearing none. The last online testifier is Joseph Babich. Mr. Babich, are you there and prepared to testify on the issue of federal preemption?
Yes, I am here. Can
Thank
you hear me?
We can hear you very
Okay.
clearly.
All right, I apologize for coming late to this get-together. I received a BS in chemistry from the University of Michigan, PhD from UCLA in the Brain Research Institute. I've spent my entire professional 50-year life studying brain biochemistry. If I can help this task force in any way, I'd be happy to do so. Just let me know by emailing me at j.bobich, B-O-B-I-C-H, at TCU for Texas Christian University.edu. With regard to federal preemption, I'm a little confused. My understanding is there's 15 or 20 states that have legalized marijuana entirely or are in the process of doing so. Can't we just cut and paste whatever they did if we want to move in that direction? Do we have to reinvent the wheel ourselves?
All right, is that a question for the task force, Doctor?
Yeah.
Does anyone on the task force wish to speak to that? Sir, I assume that you're going to speak to that in your presentation. Will you be covering that?
I will.
Okay, great. All right. Okay. Do we have any additional online testifiers? You're saying yes. All right. I'm not going to jinx it by saying this is the last one. I've done that a couple times. Is Miss Mary Wind
Click it.
ready and able to testify specifically on the issue of federal preemption?
Aloha, go ahead.
Aloha. I was concerned about HUD housing because like the other lady was talking about how the federal laws apply. And when you apply for HUD, a federal program, you have to verify on the application that you're not doing any illegal drugs or anything. So when she said, the other testifier, that she was in fear of the changes of federal regulations that might come down on residents of Hawaii. So perhaps a committee especially designed to look at what would happen, especially to poor people who are living below the poverty line that cannot even afford to pay a script and pay for the cost of joining the program even despite the dispensary. But the thing is, if you really have to lie to the federal government on the application for HUD, which is, of course, very concerning. So there's a, sort of when you go in for a HUD meeting, they really encourage you to not tell the truth on your form. So perhaps a committee could look into that situation of especially HUD housing and
Ms. Wood, you
all
have
the
30 seconds
legalities
to
of
wrap
what
it
might
up.
happen, especially to low-income patients.
All right,
Thank you
so
very
much.
much for the opportunity to testify.
And thank you for taking the time. Task force members, any questions for Ms. Wynn?
Any
based on
questions?
federal preemption?
Oh.
Anyone have any questions? I don't see any. Are we now done with online testimony, Tammy, as far as you can tell? All right. Is there anyone who called into the meeting by phone who would like to testify? Please press *9 to raise your hand when prompted. Please press *6 to unmute yourself. Tammy, does it look like we have anyone by phone? No phone testifiers. All right. Thank those folks who took the time to be here today and participate by Zoom to testify. We very much appreciate it. Mr. Ward, thanks so much for your patience. As we work on the technology there, we're ready to hear your presentation on the status of federal preemption relating to cannabis. And task force members, when Mr. Ward is done, I'll ask, of course, if any of you have any questions for him based on what he shared. No. We ready to go?
All right, aloha, and mahalo to the task force for the opportunity to present to you today. Just to give an overview of my presentation, I'd like to start with a brief introduction of the Marijuana Policy Project for those who are not familiar with this work. Then I'll give a quick introduction of myself, my work at MPP, and then I'll proceed into the presentation, which includes the timeline of cannabis reform in the US, which brings us to 2022. And then I'll go into the discussion of the framework that makes up federal preemption as it relates to cannabis and where we stand today in my body.
And just so the task force has a sense, approximately how long do you anticipate your presentation being? Just so they have a general sense.
No more than 20 minutes.
In that range. Okay, thanks very much.
So MPP, the Marijuana Policy Project, was founded in January of 1995. It is the largest organization in the United States that's focused solely on enacting humane cannabis laws. MPP's mission is to change federal law to allow states to determine their own cannabis policies without federal interference, to allow the medical use of cannabis in all 50 states and US territories, and to regulate cannabis like alcohol. MPP has been responsible for changing most of the state cannabis laws that have been reformed since 2000, including more than a dozen medical cannabis laws and the legalization of cannabis by voter initiative in Colorado, Alaska, Maine, Massachusetts, Nevada, Michigan, and Montana. MPP also assisted on the California campaign as well. MPP's team spearheaded the campaigns that resulted in Vermont and Illinois becoming the first two states to legalize cannabis legislatively in 2018 and 2019. MPP also played a leading role in passing the most recent legalization laws to pass their state legislatures, Connecticut and Rhode Island. MPP is actually comprised of two separate organizations, the MPP, which is a C4, which was founded is the main branch that deals with lobbying and ballot initiatives, and MPP Foundation, which is a C3, was founded in 1996 and is a tax-deductible educational branch. At MPP, I serve as senior legislative counsel. I've been there since 2020. And in that role, I played a role in legalization efforts in New York and New Jersey, and worked closely with the Connecticut legislature and executive branch in developing and passing Connecticut's legalization bill. My work currently covers cannabis reform efforts in Hawaii, Pennsylvania, Florida, and I monitor implementation of legalization laws in primarily the Northeast. Prior to my role at MPP, I spent nearly a decade in law and public policy, serving in legislative roles in the Connecticut State Senate, the Connecticut Department of Health, and the City of Hartford. Immediately preceding my time at MPP, I managed the civil rights and criminal defense focused law practice in Connecticut. And in 2021, I was recognized as the year by Connecticut Law Tribune. I was born here in Honolulu. I received my BA from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and my Juris Doctorate from the University of Connecticut School of Law. And I'm also currently a 329 holder, card holder here in Hawaii. With that said, I will move on to the substantive portion of our presentation. Starting with the timeline of cannabis reform here in the United States. So we'll start back in 1850, where in the United States, cannabis was sold as an over-the-counter medicine and was commonly used to treat a number of illnesses, including alcoholism, opioid addiction, and convulsive disorders. Fast forward 80, almost 90 years or so, and many states had passed laws to restrict the possession of cannabis, eliminating its availability as an over-the-counter drug. The following year in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was passed to prohibit all non-medical use of cannabis in the United States. However, it also limited medical use due to fees and regulatory restrictions that imposed significant burden on doctors prescribing cannabis. It is well noted that the American Medical Association opposed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 because the tax that was imposed on physicians prescribing cannabis, and that opposition was obviously unsuccessful as that act became law. Fast forward to 1970, October 27th of 1970, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act was enacted. Title II of the Act, the Controlled Substance Act, establishes categories varying from Schedule I, the strictest classification, to Schedule V, the least strict. And cannabis was provisionally placed in the Schedule I category, thereby prohibiting its use for any purpose. In 1972, following the passage of the Controlled Substance Act, a commission was formed under President Nixon to study the rising use of cannabis in America and also make policy recommendations. The commission, known as the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, or the Schaefer Commission, was led by former Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer, and determined in its March 1972 report to the President and Congress that that societal harms caused by cannabis were limited, and they recommended the removal of criminal penalties for possession and distribution of small amounts of cannabis. Although none of the reforms were enacted, the report was ultimately shelved. And so MPP actually just revisited the 50-year anniversary of the Schaefer Commission report, detailing the 19 states that still prohibit simple cannabis possession. 50 years after this report came out that was commissioned by President Nixon, that explained that cannabis use didn't present significant societal harms. Following that, in 1979, Operation Green Harvest begins in Hawaii and California. It ultimately was expanded to 25 states by 1982. And then one of the most significant breakthroughs in cannabis reforms in 1996, when California voters approved Proposition 215 to legalize medical cannabis. The Clinton administration, who was the president at the time, opined its opposition to the proposition and threatened to revoke the prescription writing abilities of doctors who recommended or prescribed the drug. And then fast forward to 2000, where in response to the Clinton administration's aversion to Proposition 215, a group of physicians challenged this policy as a violation of their First Amendment rights. And in September of 2000, prevailed in the case Conant versus McCaffrey, which allows physicians to recommend but not prescribe medical cannabis. In that same year, Hawaii became the first state to legalize medical cannabis through an act of state legislature. And then in 2005, the George W. Bush administration, during that administration, agents were enforcing federal law against state legal medical cannabis cultivators and patients. Many folks may recall this dark era in cannabis prohibition. And in June of 2005, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the federal government's ability to enforce federal cannabis prohibition against individuals complying with state medical cannabis laws in the case Raich versus Gonzalez. And Gonzalez versus Raich, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that Congress acted within its authority under the Interstate Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution when it prohibited even interstate non-commercial cannabis possession and cultivation as it had done in the Controlled Substance Act. In Gonzalez, the plaintiffs argued that because the cannabis in question had been grown, transported, and consumed entirely within California and in compliance with California medical cannabis laws and did not involve any commercial activity, it could not be regulated by the federal government through the Interstate Commerce Clause. The Supreme Court disagreed, reasoning that cannabis grown within California for medical purposes is indistinguishable from illicit marijuana, and that because the intrastate medical cannabis market contributes to the interstate illicit marijuana market, the Commerce Clause applied. Even where California citizens are using medical cannabis in compliance with state law, those individuals were still prosecuted by federal authorities for violating federal law. To combat state-approved medical cannabis legislation, the DEA continued sporadic targeting and arrest of medical cannabis providers and seizure of medical cannabis and business assets during, again, the start time of cannabis prohibition in the United States. Fast forwarding to 2009, the Obama administration, 1 year after President Obama, or the year President Obama took office. In the first term of the Obama administration, Attorney General Eric Holder stated that only medical cannabis providers who violate both federal and state law would be targeted for prosecution. States, starting with New Mexico, began licensing and regulating commercial medical cannabis activity. And Deputy Attorney General David Ogden issued a memorandum of guidelines for federal enforcement, while also largely affirming the earlier stated hands-off approach for state legal medical cannabis activities. So in 2009, significant departure from previous administrations, that the Attorney General stating that only folks who violated federal and state law will be targeted. In 2011, again under the Obama administration, Deputy Attorney General James Cole issued a memo specifically noting the Ogden memo that I just discussed. Those protections applied only to individuals and not commercial operations. And with that, federal authorities resumed raiding medical cannabis operations that were unregulated and unlicensed, including in Montana and California, but seemingly state legal. They didn't target regulated state legal businesses like the ones in New Mexico. The following year, in 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first two states to legalize after voter initiative. And then in 2013, the Justice Department issued a second Cole memo that offered guidance to prosecutors and law enforcement on where to focus their cannabis enforcement efforts for both medical and adult use cannabis. Federal raids and prosecutions of state legal cannabis businesses that did not implicate priorities, the ones I just mentioned, or I'm going to go on to mention, ceased. And those priorities for enforcement were preventing distribution of cannabis to minors, preventing cannabis revenues from criminal enterprises, gangs, or cartels, preventing cannabis from moving out of state where it's legal, preventing the use of state legal cannabis cells as a cover for illegal activity, preventing violence, the use of firearms, and growing and distributing cannabis, preventing impaired driving or other adverse public health consequences. Those were all the permitted enforcement activities allowed after the issuance of the second Cole memo in 2013. State legal cannabis businesses that did not involve in those activities were soon permitted. The following year in 2014, Congress steps into the discussion and adopts the Rocheboro Bar Amendment, which is was included in the spending bill, and it specifically prohibits the Department of Justice spending funds to interfere with the implementation of state medical cannabis laws. I will note that this amendment, the Rocheboro Bar rider, has been included in every subsequent bill since 2014, and later on in the presentation, I'll certainly show the language. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in December of 2014, the Justice Department announced a policy to allow recognized Indian tribes to legalize the use and sale of cannabis on American Indian reservations. The laws on reservations are allowed to be different from state and federal law, and this has been the case with state recreational or state adult use legalization. That, as in the federal government has said, it would not intervene as long as there are controls that are contained. And in 2015, one of the Sioux tribes of South Dakota voted to legalize adult use cannabis. There are a few other tribes that have also to adopt adult use cannabis laws. The most recent that I'm aware of being in the state of New York. In 2016, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, of which Hawaii is within, held that spending provisions, also the spending provisions that I mentioned in the Rocheboro Bar Amendment, also prevented the targeting of businesses complying with state medical cannabis laws. And this was counter to the DOJ's interpretation that the law only protected individuals. In that case, in the United States versus McIntosh, to 2016 Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals case. And then in 2018, the United States Farm Bill was passed, and it contained provisions legalizing and production with low levels of Delta-9 THC. It may have inadvertently allowed production of hemp products for high levels of Delta-8 THC as well. Delta-8 THC is the psychoactive component, and it's since become more popular in the US. Just figured that was a important thing to note. In 2019, the House Judiciary Committee passed the most far-reaching cannabis legalization bill to date, the MORE Act. MORE Act is a comprehensive cannabis legalization bill that also contains expungement measures and some social equity provisions. And then in 2020, the House voted in favor of the MORE Act. It passed the House for the first time. The Chamber of Commerce voted to end the federal prohibition of cannabis. And the MORE Act remains pending right now in the current Congress. And here we are in 2001, just last year, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas stated a prohibition on interstate use or cultivation of marijuana may no longer be necessary or proper to support the federal government's piecemeal approach. He was criticizing the federal government's half-in, half-out regime that simultaneously tolerates and forbids the local use of marijuana. And so words from Supreme Court Justice, but also with President Biden's nominee to Attorney General Merrick Garland, also stated in his February 2021 congressional testimony that he would state the Cole memo that I just discussed, and he also reiterated that the Department of Justice under his leadership would not pursue cases against Americans complying with the laws in states that are legalized and are effectively regulating cannabis. And also very important, in 2000, President Joe Biden became the first president to propose a budget with the Rockefeller Farm Amendment included. On March 15th, the amendment was renewed through the signing of the fiscal year 2022 omnibus spending bill, and that bill is effective through September 30th of 2022. And here is the text of the amendment. It reads, none of the funds made available in this act to the Department of Justice may be used with respect to states, and it lists all of the adult use in medical states. Actually, it just lists, the medical states, 37 medical states, to prevent states from implementing their own state laws that authorize the use, distribution, possession, or cultivation of medical cannabis. So this text is currently in our omnibus spending bill and will expire in September, and is expected to be reviewed in the following omnibus spending bill, the following session of the United States Congress. And so with that, now that I've kind of covered the history, I'll kind of discuss federal preemption, and I'll start with the question of what federal preemption is. Federal preemption is when state law and federal law conflict. Federal law displaces or preempts state law due to the supremacy clause of the Constitution of the United States, and that's found in Article 6, Section 2. But the legal question in terms of whether or not federal law preempts cannabis, state cannabis laws, the legal question is no different between medical and adult use laws. And in the 26 years since states have been passing medical cannabis laws, courts have rejected numerous preemption claims. Additionally, the federal government has never alleged in court that federal laws preempt or nullify state medical marijuana or legalization laws. In fact, the Department of Justice argued in favor of dismissing a lawsuit claiming Arizona's medical marijuana law was preempted. The case was ultimately dismissed. That case is Arizona versus United States. It was decided in 2012. Additionally, the Controlled Substance Act only preempts state laws if there is a positive conflict between state and federal law so that the two cannot consistently stand together. 21 United States Code 903 says it's not intended, essentially, the Controlled Substance Act is not intended to preempt the field of drug laws. Courts have generally held that a state law is only preempted by the Controlled Substance Act. It is physically impossible to comply with both state and federal law. For this reason, states avoid breaking the law. They avoid laws that would create that express conflict by avoiding having state-run stores or state cultivation, as state workers would certainly be in a positive conflict in terms of complying with federal and state law. So that's how many states, the workaround that many states have is that states do not engage in the retail operation of the cultivation of cannabis. They only license individuals to engage in those activities. And so non-commandeering and preemption. And so the United States system of government is one of dual sovereignty, where states can do and serve as laboratories of democracy. I'm sure we all remember that with Schoolhouse Rock. The federal government's free to enforce its own marijuana law. So, the federal government is certainly free to enforce their own laws, but they cannot require the state of Hawaii or any state to enforce federal laws. That would be unconstitutional. It's called commandeering of the state's resources, and it would be a violation of the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution. As the Arizona court ruled, while rejecting a preemption challenge, they noted it is of considerable consequence that it is Arizona's attempt at a partial decriminalization with strict regulation that makes their medical law essentially vulnerable. This view, if successful, hijacks Arizona's drug law and obligates Arizonans to enforce federal prescriptions that categorically prohibit the use of all cannabis. And the 10th Amendment anti-commandeering rule prohibits Congress from charting that course. And so that was similarly upheld, or that similar opinion was taken in Murphy versus NCAA, which was a 2018 United States Supreme Court case. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress's attempt to prohibit state authorization of sports gambling violates the anti-commandeering rule, as it is as if the federal officers were installed in state legislative chambers and were armed with authority to stop legislators from voting on any offending proposals. A more direct affront to state sovereignty is not easy to imagine. So, in that instance, this is states trying to get into sports gaming and essentially, Congress banning it. And the Supreme Court stepping in and telling Congress that they cannot do that. So the same reasoning applies to well-crafted medical cannabis and adult use laws here in the United States. Even if Congress wanted to preempt them, it could not due to non-commandeering 10th Amendment rules. Now, that is not to say that the federal government cannot send, it is prohibited from sending their own agents here in Hawaii to enforce federal law. They are certainly able to do that. However, with the Rochester-Farr amendment that prohibits resources from being used on legal or state authorized medical cannabis programs, that has not happened. And so where are we now? Okay, where are we now? So here we are in 2022, where 37 states, including Hawaii, have comprehensive medical programs. 19 states, including the District of Columbia, have adult legalization laws. Up to 6 more states have legalization ballot measures that will be voted on this November. And in practice, the Cole memo has been respected, even after it was rescinded in the Trump administration by Attorney General Sessions. Thousands of adult use cannabis businesses have openly operated. The first opened in 2014, and it has not been raided. The operators have not been prosecuted. However, the federal illegality creates some challenges, including Section 280E, which means that cannabis businesses can't deduct their business expenses for medical or adult use of their federal taxes. Many states have adopted rules to allow for deducting business expenses on their state taxes. I believe Hawaii does have that for its operators, and a number of states have that as well. The federal illegality creates difficulty for businesses finding banking. Congress has also attempted to address this through the Safe Banking Act, which actually it stalled in the Senate. And it does create problems for folks who are naturalized or immigrated US citizens, and also folks living in federally subsidized housing. Efforts to change the federal law continue. Senator Leader Chuck Schumer is refining a federal legalization bill, the COW Act, and that is in Congress right now. But states with legalization and regulation in place are allowed to participate in interstate, with the passing of the COW Act. The hope is that states will be allowed to participate in interstate and international markets upon federal legalization. And I did want to speak, one of the folks who did testify earlier spoke to an effort here in Hawaii to specifically address the conflict, and they did note this resolution that was passed in the 2021 session. And this is a copy of it, or this is actually the successor to that. So in the 2021 session, a resolution was passed that directed the Department of Health to apply for a exemption, a federal exemption for the state authorized use of cannabis in Hawaii under 21 CFR 1307.3 and 21 CFR 13.8 to 1308.43. And so the resolution passed in the 2021 year. I don't believe it was acted on, and then this resolution popped up this year in the 2022 session and was not adopted. But I did want to go over Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. That, and it's here, and I apologize about the very small print and the dense nature of my presentation. But if you look within the act, at least in section 1301, it says persons required to register requirements for modifying registration of authorizing activity as an online pharmacy, but it talks about every person who manufactures, distributes, dispenses, imports, exports, controlled substances, or proposes to engage in the manufacture, distribution, dispensing, importation, or exportation of controlled substances has to obtain the registration. And then it talks about exemption. But you'll see noted in here, it says individual. It does not have a provision related to governments or states or municipalities. And also, the resolution talks about section 1307, which does talk about an exemption, but again, it only applies to individuals and not to governments or municipalities. And so, as I mentioned, the way that states are allowed to administer medical and adult use cannabis programs is through the licensing of individuals to engage in that activity. The state of Hawaii, nor its agents, are involved in the distribution, manufacturing, sale of cannabis. They only license individuals to do that. So accordingly, the state of Hawaii does not even fall within the purview of this title and within the certified, this federal regulation. And so I do understand that the legislature did adopt this resolution, but unfortunately, it is just simply not workable based on the plain language of the regulation. And did just want to note that today, I do not know of any state or municipality or government that has, in the United States, that has applied for an exemption from the DEA or otherwise and successfully received it. And that is in, almost 22 years of 20 plus years of adult use and medical programs in the United States. And so with that, I've said a mouthful. I will open it up to questions of the task force, and mahalo for your time.
Mr. Ward, thanks so much for the comprehensive presentation. I know the task force really appreciates it. Task force members, now is the time that you have an opportunity to ask Mr. Ward questions. If so, I'm going to ask you to please unmute yourself. You can state your name before you ask your question so Mr. Ward knows who is asking the question. we'll proceed.
Chair, this is Jared Radula. I have a question.
Sure, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Jared Radula. I'm the State Narcotics Enforcement Chief. For Mr. Ward, in your research or in your experience, has there ever been any actual penalties taken against state legal participants in our medical cannabis program here in Hawaii by the federal government, irrespective of the banking issues that you pointed out? Have we had prosecutions at the state or has the federal government come in and prosecuted our state legal medical cannabis participants?
Not to my knowledge, not to my knowledge. The federal government has not come in and prosecuted state legal medical cannabis businesses here in Hawaii. Now, prior to Hawaii adopting a medical program, and even after Hawaii adopted a medical program, the federal government continues to enforce the Controlled Substances Act against non-licensed state cannabis activity. And so to answer your question, no, I do not know of any federal action against any state licensed cannabis operators in the state.
Okay, and just in follow-up, sir, do you have any statistics or numbers in terms of the those who may have been impacted by federal policy here with respect to immigration or HUD access or HUD participation in Hawaii?
Unfortunately, I don't, and I think that's a great question, and certainly something I'm trying to get my arms around in terms of figuring out what communities and what numbers and who has been most impacted by the federal prohibition. But I'm not, I do not have a firm answer on those numbers as we speak.
And I just want to be clear as well, sir. Lastly, I guess the thesis of your presentation is that a federal exemption would not be workable in this instance.
Correct. That the current law does not allow for a state or a government to apply for an exemption. That avenue, to my knowledge, is not available under federal law. The way to address the conflict between the federal prohibition and states' authorization of medical and adult use cannabis is a law from Congress.
Thank you very much, sir.
Task force members, other questions?
I have a couple.
Sure, please state your name first so Mr. Ward knows who he's speaking to.
Hi, this is Wendy Gibson Viviani. Mr. Ward, thank you very much. Did you say that the Rohrabacher Farr amendment, or well, has been expanded to include adult use, or is it still just for medical?
No, I misspoke. It's still just for medical.
Okay, and one other question, where do you get your funding? Do you have, is it state, is it local, is it?
So yeah, is a nonprofit organization. We have many funders, individuals, businesses that all donate and contribute to NPD.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gibson. Other task force members, questions for Mr. Ward based on what he presented?
I've got a question. This is Randy Gons.
Sure, Mr. Goss, please proceed.
Just for clarification's sake, we heard from a testifier earlier today, a woman, and she was talking about her son who had cannabis in her car. And it seems like she's very, very worried and often even use the word terrified regarding this federal preemption language and talk that's been out there. Given your presentation, your expertise in law and background, can you give a decent opinion and reassure this woman that she should not be terrified of the federal government coming down on her?
Right. Thank you for that question, Mr. Bonds. I do not believe that the federal government is going to come to Hana above all, remote places, to enforce, federal cannabis, policy. However, even in states where, adult use cannabis is allowed, medical cannabis is allowed, there are still prohibitions against driving while impaired. Particularly here in Hawaii, even if you are a medical cannabis user, and you are cited for an infraction, you have trace amounts of cannabis in your system, you can be charged with driving under the influence. And someone, a prior testifier talked about many of the discriminations that still exist in law, the discriminatory practices that still exist in law 20 years later for medical patients here in Hawaii, and that is one of them. That is low hanging fruit. That is an issue that many states have passed laws for, to address the fact that if you are a medical patient and you are involved in a motor vehicle infraction, that the trace amounts of cannabis found in your system cannot be used as a basis for a DUI conviction. I think that's something that the state can, legislation that the state can pass, immediately, that is in line with other states, to prevent what happened to the lady's son from happening. Now that's not to say, now if someone is impaired, actually impaired, it does violate traffic laws by crossing the line, by rolling through a stop sign, they are still subject to prosecution. And that, from the little bit I did here, sounds maybe what triggered law enforcement to maybe stop your son, but also even for medical card holders, there are personal possession limits, and those must be followed, right? And if someone is outside of those personal possession limits, they place themselves in the position to be criminally liable here in the state. And so would really caution all medical cannabis users in the state to not drive impaired, to use cannabis within state legal limits. But I do not believe that the federal government is interested in coming into Hawaii and prosecuting individuals for state authorized medical or adult use cannabis.
Thank you, Mr. Gons.
Thank you, Devon. I just got a follow-up question.
Of course.
Given that, I guess what I'm gathering here is that perhaps because there's been so much focus on this preemption, when it comes to talks in cannabis, and the legislature has been an issue, that this has kind of taken a lot of air out of the room. And there are some low-hanging fruit about what Hawaii can do to really protect their patients, and make sure that some of these fear-based ideas don't kind of take over our patient base, and that we can actually protect them. Is there any opportunity that you could provide some of those low-hanging fruit ideas to the task force that we could implement to protect our medical patients?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's that. A number of states have specifically authorized that the lawful use of cannabis cannot be used in revoking state licenses or in employment and hiring practices. A positive cannabis test can't be used to deny somebody employment. New Jersey just included that in their legalization bill. I believe New York has something similar as well. So yeah, I'm happy to discuss with the task force ways to protect medical patients here from discrimination at large for accessing the medicine, and I'm happy to do that. So,
Mr. Ward, thanks for agreeing to that. Thank you. Task force members, any other questions for Mr. Ward based on what he presented today?
This is Terry Gorman, representing the mayor of Maui County. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Ward. I have very little understanding of the legal system, but I, like many others, are very disturbed about what's happening in our Supreme Court. We seem to have conservative activist judges seated now. And you talked about the anti-commandeering rule. Would like to know is, are we at risk of having our Supreme Court overturn that situation? You call it a rule, it's not a law. And is it possible that our Supreme Court could make this a problem for Congress moving forward? Your opinion, thank you.
Thank you for the question. Well, so the anti-commandeering prohibition is actually not a law. It's in the United States Constitution. And so, for that to be overturned, it would have to be ratified by the states. It's a very lengthy multi-year process, and again, it's a constitutional provision. It's not a law, not a statute, not a federal statute. It's like the United States Constitution. The founders of the United States, when they designed the country, wanted this dual system of states' rights and federal rights, and they did not want the federal government to infringe on states' ability to make their own decisions and be laboratories of democracy. And so that is the thinking behind that provision being in the Constitution. So to answer your question on if I think the Supreme Court will address the issue, I can't speak to the future, but the fact that it's in the United States Constitution and prior decisions by the court, tend to suggest that they won't upend their interpretation of the 10th Amendment. But again, I can't predict the future. I can't predict what circumstances the Supreme Court may hear a future case or their future decisions. But as the law currently stands, the federal government's not allowed to use state agents, state employees to enforce federal law. So I apologize if that's didn't answer your question exactly, but it's the only answer I can provide is the current state of the law.
Thank you. I was not clear that is a constitutional, that it's in the Constitution that federal government cannot interfere with states. However, given this current Supreme Court, who knows? Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Gorman. Any other task force members have questions for Mr. Ward based on what he shared?
Hi, Nikos Leverins here with a comment more than a question. I would note that in 2019, the Hawaii State Legislature actually passed the resolution HCR 89 that specifically called upon Congress to remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act entirely, and also to provide for sort of the full range of banking and insurance services offered to other businesses. So when we think about preemption and the relationship between state and federal, the prior legislature has weighed in, and it's their opinion that cannabis should be removed from the Federal Controlled Substances Act. Mahalo.
Mr. Ward, I know that wasn't a question, but do you want to respond at all to that?
Yeah, if I may, I do want to note that Hawaii's federal delegation has been proponents of removing cannabis from the Controlled Substance Act. And on the Senate side, Senator Schultz voted in favor of safe banking. It hasn't come up for a full vote in the Senate, but has been a proponent of safe banking. And the House side, Representative Case voted in favor of the MORE Act. Both of Hawaii's Congress folks voted in favor of the MORE Act, which would legalize cannabis as well. And so, I do know that Hawaii's federal delegation is a proponent of uplifting the federal prohibition on cannabis, and they've co-sponsored bills. They voted in favor of bills to that effect. So
thank you
for that comment.
Thanks, Mr. Ward. Task force members, any other questions for Mr. Ward based on what he presented? I want to give Madam Chair an opportunity. Madam Chair, any questions that you might have for Mr. Ward?
No, I did not have any questions, but I do want to thank you very much for coming and presenting today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much, Mr. Ward.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right. We'll now move to agenda item 3, which is discussion regarding issues not included in the scope of the 5 established working groups that should be identified for future consideration and studied by the legislature. I want to remind anyone who wishes to testify that you have 2 minutes to provide your testimony on the agenda item. This is agenda item 3. I'll give you a 30-second warning. We'll call time in 2 minutes to provide everyone the opportunity to speak, while allowing adequate time for the task force members to work through the agenda items. Is there anyone online? First of all, anyone here in person? Sure, you just get their names? That would be great for me. And I just wanted to remind the testifiers that the 5 established groups and the task force, of course, knows this. 1 is regulation of adult use and/or medical use. 2 is tax structures, amounts, and allocations. 3 is social equity and restorative justice. 4 is market structure, and 5 is public health and public safety. And again, to our testifiers, I want you to limit your testimony to specifically those issues not included in the scope of 5 that I just read, you believe should be identified for future consideration and studied by the legislature. The first would be me, Rel. Yeah, please.
Faye Onopo, testifying on behalf of OVA Cannabis Clinic. So first off, I just want to just ask a question regarding just some ethical issues to where if there is anybody receiving money from the dispensaries, that I feel like that should be public knowledge. And then second, the dispensaries have representation on all 5 of the pigs currently, including social equity. And when we look at social equity, it's really looking at reversing the harms that have been done by the drug wars. And I think having people on that who called patients essentially criminals and illicit for engaging in cannabis use, I think that that's a conflict of interest. And I just wanted to say that publicly. As far as missing, what's missing, out of the 5 groups, I didn't see anything specifically for Native Hawaiians and for agriculture. I think that those are 2 kind of huge issues, especially when it comes to agriculture, because this could be a huge agricultural movement in our state, not only for hemp used as remediation, but also for medical cannabis. So those were the 2 things that I would like to see considered, and also the ethical issues addressed.
Great, thank you so much. Task force members, questions for Ms. Milko? Any questions based on what she shared?
I've got a quick question. This is Randy Gantz. In regards to agriculture, are there any specifics around agriculture that you would like to see addressed? As the market structure chair, I think that we could probably cover some, but if there's any specifics, I'm definitely willing to take some of those.
So I think that, when we designate ag land, there's, I haven't seen anything for cannabis specifically. And so maybe addressing that to where, the people who, get essentially, some there's, not as much of a tax burden, that type of land that's, could also be used and utilized in the cannabis space.
Thank you. Any other task force questions for Ms. Milko?
This is Nikos Leverance. I just wanted to comment that I concur with Ms. Poy's contention that those of us who are not government officials or exercise government capacity should perhaps provide the larger task force with a short bio of their knowledge, skills, and experience. I know that our pig, one of the pigs that I'm on, our medical use group, has done so. So thank you for that feedback. And I also concur that the interest of our Native Hawaiian community must, must be present in every working group. Mahalo.
Thank you. Any other questions? Looks like we've taken care of all those. Thanks so much. I have Nicole.
Nicole Buffon for the record. It's so lovely to be here with you all today. I am the executive director for the Western Region for Minorities for Medical Marijuana. We are a national nonprofit organization. We support advocacy and education within our communities. And so it's really an honor to be here today and be a part of this task force. As a national nonprofit, we are honored to be viewing the film. The reason that we're in town is because we got invited to view the film Unprescribed that was viewed at the military base yesterday at the VA office. And it was an honor because it's talking about veterans and their access to cannabis as medicine. The keynote speaker was Montel Williams and Dr. Sue Sicily, was hosted by MVEX and CAMO. The first time cannabis conversation happened on an active military base anywhere in the country. Today, that group will be meeting with the Admiral to discuss veterans' access to cannabis as medicine, despite the federal legal status. Our stance on how to maintain a medical program in Hawaii, now that you are considering adult use in your state, is aligned with Dr. Sue Sicily's recommendations. In order to maintain the true efficacy of your rare land-raised genetics and ensure that patients will always have access to it to support local co-ops such as Jason. I also support that what Mrs. Poe mentioned, as I do this work globally throughout the African diaspora, it's important to recognize the land-raised genetics that come from that region, because every island, every region has different land-raised genetics that have an abundance of medicinal value. And so I think Hawaii should focus on those land-raised genetics, speak to the native and indigenous people that have been growing those genetics for generations, and allow them
30 seconds.
And allow them to come into the fold and be a part of the business. That's how you earn the trust of the people and the community, especially patients. So that's it. I just want to say thank you so much for having me. And I appreciate you all having this public task force for these types of things to be discussed.
Thanks so much. I want to make sure before you leave, the task force might have some questions for you.
Okay, sure.
Any task force members that have any questions for Ms. Buffon? All right, looks like no.
I don't have a question, but I'm sorry, I don't have a question, but I do have a comment, if that's all right.
Sure.
First of all, I just want to thank M4MM for all of the work you guys done. I've followed you guys for a long time. I appreciate you all. In regards to land race and genetics, this is a conversation that has been happening a little bit here in Hawaii for a while. As we all know, Hawaii has a long history with cannabis. Some of the names that come to mind, Maui Wowie, things of that nature. And it is being sold on the continent. You know, it hasn't been grown in Hawaii, hasn't been grown by Hawaiian people. So rest assured, this is absolutely something that we're taking a look at. I hope to address it as the market structure chair, but bringing it up to this task force to see if it's appropriate to put it in somewhere else. I'm happy to do that. But again, rest assured, that's an issue that I think is very pointed and timely for this task force. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a state director here, so any way that we can offer our help and support in creating some advice for the social equity task force, we are here to help. So thank you so much.
We appreciate the offer. Thank you. And just a reminder, we're taking testimony only on what additional items should be identified for future consideration and study by the legislature, in addition to the 5 that have already been established. Mr. Almaderos.
Aloha mai kako, Alfred Kapiona Maderas, Kanakamoli, born and raised here in Hawaii, Hawaii. Like Ms. Mayor, former employee said, I see every single group on here, but a Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian Kanakamoli working group and agriculture group. For us Kanakamoli, cannabis is a la'au. It is very medicinal. It hasn't been talked too much within our kupuna, within our elders, but I know for a fact it has been used for many, many years within our community. That's something that needs to be done with a group. I believe a group like that would be beneficial for everybody. It wouldn't be looked at like it's an outside source that's doing everything for the cannabis in Hawaii. So implementing Kanakamoli and Hawaiians involved in this is something that needs to be done. One thing needs to be done, I believe, is public comments, public questioning if possible. I see we asked the task force, but I'm sure there's other people that's watching that has questions as well that could be very beneficial and helpful on this. Thirdly, I'd like to thank Devon Ward. You're an incredible person. You fight for many different things, and I hope you can help us in many different ways in Hawaii. I appreciate you. And everybody here that's speaking up, Miss Michelle Nakata, appreciate your time. And to the women out there, we're gonna fight for you. I'm one of those Kanaka that stand side by side with you. You know, her body, her choice. Trust me, I'm a loud voice. I speak up loud and proud. So mahalo for everybody out here and doing what you guys gotta do. Cannabis cures. That's the main thing you guys gotta know. It is not a drug, it is a medicine that has been used forever.
Thanks,
Forever.
Mr.
So mahalo,
Medeiros. Thank
everybody.
you. Any questions for Mr. Medeiros? All right. thanks so much for-
Again, no questions, but I do have a comment to respond to him. So as a co-chair of the social justice or social equity committee, again, rest assured that we are absolutely looking in to the Native Hawaiian conversation, bringing them to the table. I've been working with the Native Hawaiian hui to bring them to the table to provide some feedback. Also, in terms of La'au and looking into the indigenous practices that have been here for generations, again, rest assured, there will be that conversation, and we will be putting out some information in the near future about listening sessions our social equity committee will be doing. So we'll be taking all the public testimony and all the public input we can get. I think it's super important to have these listening sessions. So be on the lookout, and we'll make sure to put that information out when available.
All about Randy, appreciate you.
Thanks, Mr. Gotts. That does it for the in-person testimony. We do have two Zoom testifiers. The first one is Dr. Otto. Dr. Otto, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you clearly. Please proceed.
Great. Thank you, Chair, members of the task force, Dr. Clifton Otto, and thanks for the opportunity to address agenda item 3, issues not included in the 5 established working groups. I'm glad to see that we're getting to this issue. It was on the first agenda and we ran out of time. And then the second working group, second task force meeting, task force working groups had already been formed. And we weren't able to address this at the second meeting. So I'm grateful that we're getting to this. You now have a very nice review of the history of the federal preemption issue. And it seems like this issue is going to touch just about every single working group. And so it may be helpful to break this off as a separate working group because of its complexity, and whether that group would address some of the individual issues that the state could address, or maybe it could look at a larger solution that could take care of all of these conflicts at once. But in any case, perhaps you would consider something like an unintended consequences working group to identify and make recommendations on the negative consequences that patients and end users face when they must violate federal law to participate in the state authorized medical use of cannabis, to include steps the state can take to prevent such consequences. So those are my comments, and I am available for questions. Aloha.
Thanks, Dr. Otto. Appreciate it. Any task force members who have questions for Dr. Otto? All right, hearing none. The last name that I've been given is James Anthony. Mr. Anthony, you prepared to testify on agenda item 3.
Thank you, Honorable Chair, members of the task force. I hope you can hear me okay this afternoon.
We can hear you very clearly.
Thank you. It's a little bit difficult to hear when we speak at the same time, but I'm going to assume that we're good to go. I'm impressed that there are 70 people participating that I can see on Zoom. I'm not quite sure how many are in the room with you there. I see a few in the gallery. I think that indicates to you that your task force is a matter of some public interest and is being closely watched. I want to thank, in particular, Mr. Medeiros from Waianae for coming down and being there and representing the Native Hawaiian farmers on Oahu. And I just want to remind you all, and in particular, the 2 chairs of the Social Equity Working Group, that you are being closely watched, and we appreciate your stated intention to do the right thing by Native Hawaiians and other victims of the war on drugs, and for the continuity of medical access and consideration of farmers. So thank you. I also want to just remind you before I go over my testimony briefly, is that while a working group, one of these so-called PIGs, need not seek public testimony, you can do so. And I would urge you to consider doing that and to include people like Ms. Fui Maono Po and Mr. Medeiros in your deliberations as a working group.
And Mr. Anthony, you have 30 seconds, please.
Oh, good. I submitted my written testimony. I urge you to take the broadest interpretation of social equity. It's not just narrowly construed cannabis criminalization. There are some other points that I made there. Please do take a look at that, and thank you for your public service.
Thank you, Mr. Anthony. Questions of the task force for Mr. Anthony? Seeing none, we have one other testifier by Zoom, Lori Keehan. Lori, you there?
So I hope that this is also the right time for me to, address some things that may not already be on the agenda, which is unintended consequences that are, cannabis clearly helps a lot of people, but it also hurts some people. And if we legalize this, which I think we should do, because then we can research it and regulate it, then we also have to have a plan to help the people that it does hurt, because they're out there and they do not deserve to be an unintended consequence for the good of everyone else. And I will tell you that, there's a lot of easy fixes. It's like the gentleman, the Kanaka Maoli. I have a friend who's Kanaka Maoli who is taking the time to work with my son to figure out which strains are best for him, because nobody's doing that. The doctors aren't doing that. And so he's trying to help him find something that gives him a lesser reaction than the things that are in the medical marijuana dispensaries. They're too strong for just the general population, but they work really well for a lot of people. So I don't want to see anyone hurt who it helps, but we do need to help the people it hurts, and we need to have a plan in place, or we're going to see a lot more people like my son who are out there with cannabis-induced psychosis, possibly schizophrenia, but he has never been diagnosed. He didn't get stopped because he ran a stop sign. There are no red lights in Hana. So the reality is that he was stopped because he was acting weird. And they didn't find anything that
You have 30 seconds. I apologize. I know this is a very personal testimony, but you have 30 seconds, please.
I understand, but I just really hope that we have a plan in place where we can help our loved ones when they are hurt by this, not helped by this. And he thought it was the holistic approach to dealing with his anxiety. And now it is nothing but a problem for him. But it could help somehow if someone would take the time to help him understand what are the right strains for him.
Thank you, Ms. Kihani. Appreciate it. Task force members, any questions for the witness? Seeing none, we have a testifier by Zoom, Joseph Bobbitt. Mr. Bobbitt.
Okay. I think with regard to federal interference, considering the meth problem in Hawaii and the fentanyl problem in Hawaii, I cannot imagine any sane DEA agent prioritizing cannabis above those very serious problems. It seems to me we now have at least 20 state legislatures that have crafted laws that we could examine, pick out paragraphs and sentences that would be useful for us to create the fundamentals of a legalization law for Hawaii. And then we could get on with details of what ifs and so forths and craft it to make it perfectly useful for Hawaii.
All right. Doctor, do you have any questions about the any issues that weren't covered by the 5 groups that have been established? Any testimony on that issue?
Involving Hawaiians is going to be a big problem. I think it's a good idea and other minorities, but it's going to be difficult to craft that part. that's something that we will have to work on ourselves.
Task force questions, task force members, any questions for Dr. Bosch?
No.
Not hearing any. Do we have any any phone testifiers? Anyone who called into the meeting by phone would like to testify, please press *9. Raise your hand when prompted. When asked, please press *6. Unmute yourself. Do we have anyone?
No.
No phone testifiers. All right. So task force members, we're now ready to move into the discussion by you regarding issues not included in the scope of the 5 established working groups that you identified for future consideration and studied by the legislature. Again, I'm going to repeat them for you. 1 is regulation of adult use and or medical use. 2 is tax structures, amounts, and allocation. 3 is social equity and restorative justice. 4 is market structure, and 5 is public health and public safety. Does any task force member wish to speak to any other issues not included in those 5 that you believe should be identified for future consideration and study by the legislature?
Yeah,
Madam Chair, yeah.
I do. I agree. This is Wendy Gibson Viviani. I would like to see the unintended consequences group also. Just to explore not only what can be done to fix the state and federal conflicts that affect pretty much every aspect of our medical cannabis patients' lives. But also to maybe establish some sort of a database for collection of data about drug interactions and other possible harmful things that are happening that we're just not aware of. We need to have some sort of avenue to collect this data. So, yeah, I would like to see what maybe a committee just structured to look at what's happening.
Thanks, Ms. Viviani. Task force members, again, we're talking about identified for future consideration and studied by the legislature. Any other input, any other comments that task force members want to share as it relates to that issue? Madam Chair.
So thank you.
I hear you, Michelle.
You can hear me okay? Thank you. I just wanted to comment to everybody that we will be summarizing all of the comments and the recommendations that were presented today, and ensuring that these issues are all documented for inclusion in the final report from the task force as a part of its recommendations for additional issues that need to be considered before, as a part of Hawaii's movement towards a dual use system. Obviously with just a few months left to go for these task force meetings and, having to comprise this final report, the number of things that need to be considered is enormous, I think, as everybody is beginning to find out, if you were not aware before participating in these sessions. And there's much more that needs to be looked into and addressed. And we just wanted to ensure that this information is at least captured so that it isn't lost in the movement towards legalized adult use.
Thank you for the comments and your clarification. Any questions for the chair based on what she shared, task force members?
Harry Gorman, representing the mayor of Maui County. In looking at the existing task forces, and I don't intend to make unintended consequences sort of a catch-all for other things, but until the issue of banking has been solved in the state of Hawaii, that will continue to be a problem that will plague both the medical program and a recreational program should that come to pass. And I don't know which group should take a look at the banking situation. Other states have worked around it on a statewide level. Hawaii is still sort of cobbling something together that I don't think is safe for the patients and those involved in the industry. So that's my comment. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ms. Gorman. Does any task force member wish to speak to the issue of banking raised by Ms. Gorman? All right. Any other task force comments before we move on to agenda item 4? We're wrapping up now on agenda item.
Chair, is the slide deck from Mr. Ward gonna be available to us?
The answer is yes to that question. It
Thank
will
you,
be
Chair.
available. You're welcome. All right, Madam Chair, I'm going to turn the meeting back over to you.
Okay. Okay, microphone doesn't seem to like me. Just to thank everybody for their participation, everybody who came in person, as well as those of you who participated online. Our next meeting will be held on July 25th. Same time. Task force again will be virtual. However, per sunshine law requirements, we will maintain a site for public to come and attend in person. Thank you very much. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Oh,